After the massive revolt of 1857, a totally different kind of struggle started bubbling up across India. This wasn't a story about kings or soldiers in uniform. Nope, this was about ordinary farmers. They were being pushed to the absolute limit by colonial policies and local landlords, and they finally decided to fight back for their land, their dignity, and really just for their survival. So let's get into this incredible story of resistance.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? I mean, on one side, you've got the most powerful empire on the planet, with its laws, its courts, its armies, the whole shebang. And on the other side, you've got peasants, farmers, armed with, farm tools, maybe some sticks and stones, and their own sheer will to survive. So how on earth did they do it? Let's find out.
All right, so to really get why people revolt, you first have to understand the kind of pressure they're under. And for the Indian peasant back in the 19th century, that pressure was just immense. It was coming from all sides, squeezing them tighter and tighter until, well, something just had to break.
What you're seeing here is a system, a trap, a downward spiral that was almost impossible to escape. It started with heavy colonial taxes. To pay them, farmers had no choice but to borrow money from local moneylenders, usually at insane interest rates. And once they were in that debt trap, it was basically game over. They'd lose their land, their crops, even their cattle, and end up as laborers on the very fields their families had owned for generations.
And who was the local face of all the suppression? More often than not, it was the zamindar, the powerful landlord. Think of them as the middlemen, the ones on the ground squeezing the peasants for every last coin, with ridiculously high rents and all kinds of made-up illegal fees. They left the farmers with practically nothing.
So this brings us to the most famous, most widespread, and maybe the most intense of all these uprisings, the Indigo Revolt. It was this massive movement of peasants in Bengal standing up to European planters who were forcing them to grow indigo, the plant used to make that deep blue dye.
And let's be really clear here, this was not a fair business deal, not even close. The planters would lock peasants into these completely fraudulent contracts. They'd have to grow indigo on their best land, the land they needed to grow rice to feed their own families. And the price they got for the indigo, it was a tiny fraction of what it was actually worth. The whole system was a scam built on pure exploitation.
So how did the planters enforce these crooked deals? Simple, through sheer terror. They hired gangs of armed thugs called lathials to do their dirty work. We're talking kidnappings, beatings, locking farmers up illegally. They'd burn down houses, destroy food crops, and even attack women and children. This wasn't business, it was brutal, violent coercion.
Now you might be thinking, couldn't they just go to the courts for help? Well, no. The whole system was rigged. The European magistrates, the judges who were supposed to provide justice, almost always sided with their fellow Europeans, the planters. This popular saying just captures that feeling of hopelessness perfectly. The very people who were supposed to protect them were actually helping to destroy them. Just look at how quickly this all happened. In late 1859, a government notice gets misunderstood, giving peasants a spark of hope. That's all it took. Led by two brothers, Digambar and Bishnu Biswas, farmers in one district just flat out refused to grow indigo. And when the planters sent in their thugs, the villagers fought back. The idea spread like wildfire, and by the end of 1860, just over a year later, the entire indigo system in Bengal had pretty much collapsed.
And you've got to appreciate how smart their tactics were. It wasn't just about fighting back with spears and stones. They were incredibly organized. They went on rent strikes. They pooled their money together to hire lawyers and fight the planters in court. And they used social boycotts, basically cutting off the planters from the local community. No one would work for them, no one would sell to them. It was a war on every front.
And people took notice. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Intellectuals and journalists in the cities like Harish Chandra Mukherjee started writing about the peasants' cause, telling their story to the wider world. And this quote just shows you how big of a deal it was. He's calling it a revolution brought about by ordinary farmers.
But here's the thing, the Indigo Revolt, as amazing as it was, wasn't an isolated incident. This spirit of resistance, this pattern of peasants getting organized and fighting back against their immediate oppressors, well, it started popping up in other parts of India too.
And what's cool is how they adapted their tactics. So you see in Pabna in the 1870s, the main bad guy was the zamindar, the landlord, so their primary weapon was the law. They organized rent strikes and took their landlords to court. But then a few years later in the Deccan, the enemy was the moneylender. So what did they do? they used social boycotts, and in this really powerful move, they seized and burned the debt records that were keeping them trapped. Now, this is a really fascinating detail. Listen to this slogan from the Pabna movement. They're not saying down with the British Empire. They're saying they want to be tenants of the Queen directly. It shows that their anger was aimed at the local guys, the landlords. They actually saw the Queen as this distant, maybe even just ruler who they could appeal to if they could just get past the local tyrants.
Okay, so after all that struggle, after all that fighting, what did it all add up to? What did they really achieve? Well, these movements had some truly incredible victories, but it's also important to understand their limitations. Let's break it down.
So the wins were huge. First, they brought farmers together. We're talking amazing unity between Hindu and Muslim peasants fighting side by side. They also managed to stop the absolute worst abuses, and they even forced the government to pass new laws to protect them. But maybe the most important thing, they proved to themselves and to everyone else that when they got organized, they had real power. But on the flip side, there were clear limits. These movements were laser-focused on specific local problems. Stop growing indigo, lower the rent, burn the debt papers. They weren't trying to kick the British out or end colonialism itself. They didn't really have a big long-term vision for a whole new society. So once their immediate goal was met, the movement usually just fizzled out.
So what's the big picture takeaway here? What's the lasting legacy of all these struggles? Well, they were way more than just a bunch of random riots. They were really the first stirrings of mass action, and they planted the seeds for a much, much bigger fight that was still to come.
And this is the absolute key. The courage, the organization, and the success of these peasant movements, they became a powerful lesson, a blueprint for the next generation of India's nationalist leaders. They showed that you could mobilize the masses, the ordinary people, to fight effectively against injustice. That experience would become a cornerstone of the entire freedom struggle.
And that kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. When you look back at these farmers, uniting across religious and caste lines, using this mix of direct action, legal fights, and social pressure, you have to ask yourself, what can their story teach us today about how ordinary people can stand up to powerful and unjust systems? It's a legacy that is very, very much alive.